Hello and welcome to round 5 coverage here where we've got Matt Light playing the Aura's deck, sometimes called Blouses or Blossoms or something like that.
Bogles, Boggles, whatever you want to call it.
And he's playing James Corwood with his junk deck.
Pretty much a standard collection of decent 4-ofs and then a lot of 1-ofs.
So let's talk a little bit about both of these decks then. What do we expect from the Aura's deck against Junk in this matchup?
Well, the whole idea of the Aura's deck that it just simply makes a 1-1 with Hexproof, usually Glade Cover Scout or Slippery Bogle, and it just goes ahead and stacks enchantments on it until the creature just becomes enormously impossible to deal with. Jim doesn't have a huge amount of interaction game 1. He does have a Kasali Pride Mage. I think his main hope is just to make big creatures as fast as possible and just try and outrace Matt. Hope Matt gets a little bit of a dodgy draw. I think if Matt gets a Daybreak Coronet onto one of his hexproof guys, then Jim's going to have major troubles in this game.
How fast is the Junk deck then compared to Aura's?
Well, the Junk deck can come out pretty quickly. I mean, it does have 4 Loxodon and Smiters in it, which it more than likely is going to drop turn 2 a lot of the time. And it also has Wiltleaf Liege as well, so it can put damage down pretty quickly. But the whole problem with that is that Matt has 4 enchantments in his deck which give his hexproof creatures protection from creatures, and he also has the Daybreak Coronet to lifelink his way past any sort of major creature storm. I think that game 1 Matt's pretty heavily favoured, however game 2 and 3 might see Jim come up with some pretty hateful stuff from his sideboard. We know that he has both Spellsky and Chalice of the Void in his sideboard for Matt's deck.
So what have we seen in play here so far?
We've got Noble Hierarch on Jim's side, and Loxodon Smite has just come down turn 2. That's pretty much perfect for Jim. If he wanted to have a perfect start, that'd pretty much be it at this point. If he can follow that up with Wiltleaf Liege, he has some pretty serious power on the board at that point. So it's really up to Matt to come up with a response for that now. The only saving grace is that Loxodon Smiter doesn't have Trample and neither does Wiltleaf Liege, so Matt can always, if he overloads on 1-drops, he can just stick a load of 1-drops in the way.
Now, we often talk about Magic and how from time to time, if you are shall we say, a weaker player, very often playing sort of simpler decks helps in that respect. Would you class Aura's as being one of these decks because of how little interaction you do with it in comparison to some other decks?
It is a deck that tries desperately to minimise interaction with the opponent. Matt's got Spirit Mantle there on his, I believe that's Glade Cover Scout, so that's a pretty unfortunate thing for Jim because he can't beat through that, but he has drawn his Kasali Pride Mage, so he's going to get both Exalted triggers off of the Pride Mage and the Noble Hierarch and then blow up the Spirit Mantle. So Matt's going to take 6 and go down to 8 pretty early here. But on the note that you just said, yeah, there are decks like Green White Aura's, decks like Infect as well, which are mainly trying to really just negate the amount of interaction that your opponent can have with you, pick up as many free wins as possible, because if you're playing a deck that just isn't prepared for dealing with this Aura's deck, you're going to lose to it. So you have to prepare some way. The only problem with these sorts of decks is that once people do start heavily preparing with them, they lose a lot of their surprise factor.
One of the good things about Aura's at the moment is that there isn't really much splash hate. If you think a lot about, say, the Eggs deck in the modern format, the one reason why it struggles to reach tier 1 is because a lot of people have hate for robots, which also is very effective against Eggs.
Yeah, Stony Silence has become a much sideboarded card in pretty much any deck which has white in it. And
however, the Aura's deck, there isn't really any splash hate from other decks in it for at the moment.
No, there's not a huge amount. The only real hatred that might come out of the board, things like Chalice of the Void and Spellskite, and Spellskite on its own isn't really that impressive against the Aura's deck.
Spellskite would maybe be something that certain people wouldn't sideboard in because it's not immediately obvious that it's a good card.
I don't know about that. I mean, you're enchanting your guy. Spellskite's going to be about as good as it gets at that point. The only thing that does come to mind is that Daybreak Coronet can't be Spellskited. Well, it can be, but nothing will happen because the Spellskite would be an illegal target for the Coronet. So you can't move one of your. You can't move the Daybreak Coronet over to your Spellskite, but there are certainly a lot more. There's certainly a lot more powerful cards that can be brought in. Plus, Matt has access to 4 Path to Exile, so it's not like Spellskite's going to hang around tremendously long. Jim has established a really huge board presence here. Gaddock Teague doesn't do a huge amount against Matt, but Wiltleaf Leech certainly does and turns everything into a pretty massive threat at this point. It also appears like Matt's a little bit overloaded on 1-drops. He appears to have drawn 50% of the 1-drops in his deck in the first sort of 15 cards. So he's got the draw that Jim would have wanted, which is to basically struggle on creating a huge monster, and Jim's had pretty much about as good a draw as he can get game 1 here, I think.
Matt would also be looking for a Spirit Link and things like that to just be able to race.
I think Spirit Link's in his sideboard, but he would be looking mainly for a Coronet at this point. If he can put a Coronet on that Glade Cover Scout here, he can still race from this point in. Unfortunately, with it only being 4 power at the moment, it's not really a huge deal for James. But if he can put a Daybreak Coronet on it, it'll become a 7 power Vigilance life linking creature, and I'm not sure that James would be able to race that even with Gavany Township in play, because he's simply getting Abyssed every turn and Matt's gaining 7 life every turn.
I'll try, so I'll keep an eye on both. Sorry.
Yet another Glade Cover Scout from Matt. This really isn't the draw that he wanted.
Yeah, it's not true. I don't know.
And that's Ethereal Armor, giving his Glade Cover Scout +3/+3 in first strike. So he could attack James down to 3 here, but of course he'd die on the swing back, so that's not really going to help him too much. Jim paths his Noble Hierarch, I believe. Yeah, he's getting his Swamp in case he draws into his Lingering Souls. That's mainly what Junk's splashing black for. It's mainly a white-green deck, but it does have black for the flashback on Lingering Souls. Has some of the same annoyances Maverick does in Legacy, where you just feel like you shouldn't lose to it, but you end up doing on an awful lot of occasions. That's Orzhov Pontiff, and it's going to wipe out Matt's Glade Cover Scout and leave him open. So.
Oh, indeed, yep. That ends game 1, and we'll be right back.